Hey Grandmasters, Mike from the WCA. We're going to take a look at one of the games played by the student we featured in the update. His name was Jason Shi. Jason studied with us in around 2007, 2008. One of the original WCA students. Incredibly hardworking, studied a lot of hours, really worked hard at the game, and recently made masters. So that's why we made a little video about him, put some news about him in the update. Really proud of Jason. Anyway, so he has the white pieces here, and he's playing a master named Ralph Zimmer. Ralph's been around for a long time, very solid master. And this was played kind of close to when Jason just made master. So Jason was slightly lower rated at the time. So let's take a look at the action here. Jason has white, and Ralph had just played bishop to a6, and it's white's turn in this position. But let's take a look at a couple of things before we get on with the game. Let's look at this highlight here. Jason's pawn on e6. That pawn is really advanced far up the board, and we like to say that the furthest pawn that you own in the position kind of tells you how much space you have. So the further it is up the board, the more space behind the pawn you get to use. So if you look at my mouse cursor here, you can see all these squares in here. Even though black has pieces that control those squares, in terms of getting to them, it's very easy for white to use this space, especially for the heavy pieces. The rooks and the queen can't always slide through these pawns when you have this type of structure. So in terms of space, Jason has more right now. Let's look at a couple of other things. The king. Jason hasn't castled yet, so you always have to be on the lookout for tactics. You know, there really isn't anything here, but if, let's just say black takes this pawn on f2, king takes, then there could be bishop check. There's nothing here, but it's definitely something that should come across your eyes when you see your opponent's king stuck in the middle of the board. Let's see, what else here? How about the knight up there on b8? When you have a minor piece that hasn't developed, and we're clearly in the middle game here, that means the rooks are not connected. Not always a big deal, but it's pretty clear that black wants to get this knight out at some point and connect the rooks and then start working on these files here. So the problem, if you look at the knight, is the knight doesn't really have any squares right now because the two pawns that Jason has are controlling c6 and d7, and you can't put your knight on your bishop, so that's an issue for black. So his plan is, at some point, going to be to get that knight into the battle. So with that brief introduction, let's take a look at how the game went on from here, and you'll see that these players kind of picked off some of the ideas that we were talking about. So it's white to play. So Jason solves problem number one. He castles. That gets his king out of the middle, and he gives black a chance to play from here with his own ideas. And Ralph decides to make a trade here, and he takes the bishop on c4. And at the WCA, we're always telling the kids, never make a trade unless the trade helps your position. And it's not so easy to make that trade because right now the white bishop sort of looks like a big pawn in here because these pawns here restrict his movement, but there's a concrete reason why he's making that trade. When he makes the trade, you'll see his idea. He opens up this square here on a6, and the knight's going to have a really nice path into this square, into b4, which is an outpost square. And if you remember us telling you in class, an outpost square is a square on your opponent's side of the board. So in this case, this is Jason's side, right? So if the knight lands here on b4, it's going to be an outpost. It's on his side, protected by your own pawn, by a friendly pawn, and the enemy pawns, or your opponent's pawns, are not in position to chase this piece away. So if Ralph can sink this knight into b4, that's going to be a pretty good piece. So that's why he went for the trade. So Jason has to take back. In comes the knight, as planned. And then Jason plays a really nice move. He plays knight f7, sinking the knight as deep into black's territory as it can really go, right? It's pretty hard to put a knight on the 8th rank. But here on the 7th, the knight is really annoying. You always have to look out for tactics when you have a piece like that so close to your enemy's position. So in this position, black plays a very natural move, rook a to b8, controlling the b file, attacking the pawn down here on b2, and Jason protects the pawn with the other knight. So his knights are doing a nice job of restricting the black rooks. You'll notice, however, I highlighted this pawn on b2, which was attacked by the rook, but now when the knight moved, it's actually being attacked by the bishop. So Jason's willing to sacrifice a pawn here. Let's see why. Ralph took the challenge, took the pawn, rook to A to B1, attacking the bishop, and that's going to give Jason time. So he loses a pawn, but he gets his rook to an active file, and at the same time, he's going to win a tempo because black doesn't want to lose that bishop. So black puts the bishop back on f6, and you may ask why not here on g7. I think he was concerned about these pawns, possible sacrifices here, and if this pawn ever starts to run, the bishop is on a good square to take it back. The only downside to this move is that this knight here loses one of its options if it ever gets attacked. It could come in here, but it may have been more comfortable on f6. So it wasn't an easy choice for black in either case. In this position, Jason actually has a chance to play for a tactic. And as I mentioned before, when you have a knight here that I'm circling that deep into your opponent's position, always look for tactics. You'll see that white actually has 3 pieces attacking this pawn here on e5. And if Jason goes for that sacrifice, let's just take a look at if black accepts. And let's say we take with the bishop. So you've taken a pawn with a piece, they take your piece, and then you take another pawn. So in this position, you get 2 pawns for that piece. Now don't forget, you've already given up a pawn down here, so technically you only have 1 pawn for your piece. But there's a lot going on here if this sacrifice were to happen. Let me show you a couple of highlights. 1, the bishop is forking the 2 rooks. So at any point, you can pick up 2 points of material by trading your bishop for one of those rooks. That's one idea. Another one, pay very close attention to Jason's 2 center pawns now. You'll notice in this position, there are no black pawns blockading those. Let's go back to the original position. And here, again, I'll show you these 2 pawns that we're talking about. Here, the 2 black pawns have them blockaded. But in the sacrifice position, we would have this set up. So here's a question for you. What are these 2 pawns worth? When this bishop moves, these 2 pawns are both free to advance. So a beginner is going to say pawns are worth 1 point each. But as advanced chess players, like all you guys are now, you know that 2 connected passed pawns this deep in enemy territory have to be worth more than just 2 points. So that has a lot going on there too. And let's look at one more. If you look at the black pieces in this position and you ask yourself, what's their goal now? If this sacrifice were to happen, what exactly are the black pieces working toward? Because they're kind of scattered. The 3 highlighted pieces on this side, on the right side, or on the king side of the board, they're kind of cut off from their friends over here. And the opposite is true. It's like these pieces on this side of the board don't seem to be working with these guys. And it's not clear exactly what black is going to do in this position because the pieces really aren't working so well. So back here, after bishop went to f6, Jason had a chance to play a very, very promising sacrifice. Instead, he decided to take a pawn here on a7. And by doing that, he does win the pawn, but the knight is temporarily out of play. And then Ralph sinks his knight into b4 like we said he would. And you have to be careful now because your knight is being attacked. And Jason plays really well from this point on. He puts his knight on c6 and tells black, okay, you can take my knight, which happened. And when I take back, the question is, this game is going to decide whether, or at least the players are going to have to decide here, is this pawn that I'm circling, is it now a weak pawn because it doesn't have protection, or is it very strong because it's only 2 boxes away from becoming a queen? And that's very, very common in high-level chess games. You'll see players have a weakness, or at least something that appears to be weak, and it's white's job to prove that it's not weak, and it's black's job to prove that it is, and very often the person who wins the game is the one who understands the position better. So here, Black puts the queen on A8 and immediately puts pressure on the pawn. And Jason decides to protect the pawn tactically. He says, okay, you can't take the pawn because I'm going to attack your knight. So you take my pawn, I'll take your knight. And it's funny how tactics work in chess. In this position, if you had the black pieces, you kind of get to do this really cool conversion. And what do I mean by that? What if you took this pawn down here with your knight? So now instead of white taking pawns with pieces, you're going to do it to white. So say they take back with their king. Now they can't take back, by the way, with the rook because there's a tactic, or it's just rook takes rook down here would be really bad. So if you take with the king, now the the black queen can take the pawn, and guess what? Let's show you a quick highlight. See these two pawns here? They're connected and they're passed pawns, just like the position we showed you before. You have to be real careful. I think we were looking at this position, right? After Jason's chance to sacrifice. You see how these two pawns are connected and there are no black pawns that can stop it? These guys are probably a little more dangerous because they're closer to queening than in the other position, which would have been here. But hiding in this position is the same idea. These two pawns, if they start running up the board, can create real problems for white, and plus the white king is kind of exposed here. And I'm also adding this diagonal highlight just to show you the strength of this bishop up here on f6. It's a really strong piece. So after h3, in the real game, maybe Ralph had a chance to take on f2. That would have been interesting. Instead, he plays the very natural knight to e5, just jumps the knight into the middle, and Jason trades. Now, how to take back? If you take with the bishop, which looks, like a natural move if you don't want to break up your pawns, but then Jason will just continue with these very natural trades, and he'll keep trading. He'll take your rook, you take back, and after queen takes c5, black is in a lot of trouble here. And the reason for that primarily is this pawn here now, which is going to be a real problem to stop. This pawn is dangerously close to becoming a queen, and you'll also see that a lot of the black pawns, or two of them anyway, or at least they're attacked right now without defense. The white king is very, very safe, and this rook is about to get into the battle. So that looks like a pretty good continuation. So that's why Ralph decided to take with his pawn. And by doing so, he eliminates the exchanges I showed you, but it does temporarily keep this bishop out of play. He's really locked in right now. So Jason to play takes the pawn on c5, and this is starting to look pretty good for him. And Ralph gets right behind the pawn right away, just trying to slow up the pawn, not going for counterplay on other parts of the board. But the problem with playing this way, when you do that to a rook, is you allow moves like c7. And I want you to just make a quick comparison here between the rook that I'm highlighting on c8 and Jason's rook on b1. There's a term in chess, they call it rook span, like wingspan. If you were to measure the length or the distance of wings on an airplane, they call that wingspan. It's like how far can you stretch your arms out. They do that with basketball players too. Here in chess, some writers use the expression wingspan, and rook span. I'm thinking of airplanes. This rook has a completely open file, so the length of its span here is 7 squares. We won't count the square that it's on, but you can see that there are 7 empty squares. This rook here, it's 0, unless it takes this pawn. It really can't move, and by coming to this square, it also took away some of the squares for this rook here on f8. So by playing this way, trying to hold back this pawn, the black pieces are getting a little tied up. So Jason to play, black to play queen a6, and that attacks a pawn here, and Jason decides to protect it with knight d8. Another idea would have been to play rook f to d1, just bringing your last piece into the game. Giving up this pawn would run into the same idea. The knight would just come to d8. But it sort of works out that way in the end anyway. So let me show you what happened. He plays knight to d8, and Ralph just can't take the pressure of this knight in here, and these pawns getting so close, so he decides to give up an exchange. And that means rook for a minor piece. So he takes. Jason takes back, making a queen. Rook has to take that queen. And in this position, you'll see the pawn is being attacked again. He defends it by offering a queen trade. Ralph says no, I don't blame him. You don't really want to trade queens in this position because this pawn is going to be very difficult to stop. And here it comes. A5, king moves to g7. Rook coming to d1. Very important concept when you're on the attack or you have the initiative. Bring your last piece into the battle. Always very important to remember that idea. Bring in the last piece. Rook c8, avoiding the trade, and he penetrates with queen b7. And at this point, Ralph's getting a little desperate, and he comes up with an idea that's pretty clever. So he plays e4, which does two things. His plan is to make contact with this pawn down here on f2, and he also wants to open up this bishop. So maybe you guys can see what he has in mind here. Jason continues with his plan, pushes the pawn to a6, and now the two pawns here, this pawn duo, are going to make their first threat. Jason pushes all the way up, and now the move e3. Jason trades queens, rook takes his forced, and then rook d7. So that was his idea, to trade the queens off, put his rook on the 7th rank, and protect this pawn. And now Ralph plays a really clever move. He takes the pawn with check. And what do? Should you take that pawn? Well, you really shouldn't. If you take it, you still have an advantage, but you're going to run into this move, rook takes a7. And if you weren't paying attention, or if you're not doing enough of your tactics, you're going to fall for moves like this. So if you take, then the bishop checks, forking, getting the piece back. King goes to f3, bishop takes, you take the pawn, and let's say I move my king up to f6. So in this position, black is still in trouble. Why are they in trouble? Well, it's an exchange or a rook for a minor piece. The problem is, though, white is going to win, but it's going to take a lot of work to win this. This pawn is going to need defense, number one. Number two, everything is kind of hiding on one side or playing on one side of the board. And when that happens, there are times that a minor piece can set up a fortress or like a defense that's not easy to break down. Here, I think white still has good chances, but this is much, much more difficult to play than what happened in the game. So let's go back real quick to this position here. So black takes your pawn. Please be aware of these tactics. Make sure you see those in your games. And Jason very calmly just moves his king out of check and blocks the pawn. Really strong move. Bishop comes into the game. I think the idea of this was to stop this rook from coming to b8, which would have trapped this rook and forced a trade. But then Jason finishes the game nicely. Rook takes check. King f6, attacking the rook. So how would you defend your rook? What would you do here if you had the white pieces? Because don't forget, the king is also attacking your pawn here on e6. I hope you pick the move rook b to b7, which is really strong. You double the rooks on the 7th rank, put a little pressure on this pawn, you keep your guy guarded over here, and give Ralph a lot of credit. He's not giving up. He's attacking the most dangerous pawn. Jason moves his rook to free the passed pawn from running, and at the same time attacking the bishop. That's why the king can't take the pawn here. So the bishop goes to c5, and Jason just pushes. And it looks like a mistake, but there's really nothing black can do. He tried rook e8, and so, you know, at first glance it looks like black is ganging up on that pawn, but it's not going to work because of this trick. Really nice move. Rook b8, and at this point black is in big trouble. So he takes here, thinking he's going to win a pawn, but Jason just takes back, and there's really no way to stop him from queening. If you take the pawn with your bishop, he just takes back with the rook, and it's 2 rooks against nothing. If you take the rook, he's going to make a queen. and that's going to end the game pretty quickly. Okay, guys. Hope you enjoyed the game. Again, we're really proud of this kid. Maybe he's on his way to 2,300 now. We'd love to see that. Okay, we'll see you next week in class.